Thank you very much. Can you hear well? Well, thank you very much, Rick and Pam, and also Jamie Albert from the Center for the Public Humanities at UF for this invitation to share this book that is that I'm working on and that is very dear to me. This is the first time I present in public and in English this research because the book is written in Spanish, but I translated some sections for you to listen to. As you heard before, I am actually a Latin Americanist, and I work on indigenous people. I speak Quechua, so this is kind of far from what I normally do. But it was the death of my father like 3 years ago, who that kind of triggered this idea of doing this research. And I can tell you it's very interesting because I have done research in very remote indigenous communities in native languages, and it was less difficult than interviewing my relatives in Spain. So, like my own because there is all this silence that surrounds all this period, and a lot of things that I'm going to tell you about really surprised me because I didn't know, even though I grew up going there, I didn't know anything about my own past, even though I'm a learner of other people's cultures and past. So that was very kind of a journey for me. So I'm gonna read some parts. The work is kind of literary, so I'm gonna read some parts of it, and then I hope we can have a conversation about some concepts that I'm developing. So let me start with this is also. Let's see. Well, not working. Yeah, I'm going there. So I'm going to talk about memory and objects a little bit. This is something that I inherited from my father and that came from my family. And that is what started kind of the search for the past. So I start the story. In a cardboard wrapper, tucked under a window gathering moisture was the painting, sorry. It was a still life with dark, almost black background, with a large skull at the bottom right, a crucifix at the top in the center, and a figure dressed in habit on the left of the canvas who fixed its static gaze on the crucifix. Below was an open book, on top of it an inkwell and a pen, and on the left another book and some objects that could not be clearly identified. Well, this is the painting after it was restored, but it was not the state in which it was when I got it. On the open book was a signature. It was a couple of initials that could be two capital A's or two R's, followed by a surname, De Arellano, underneath the signature, a place and a date, Córdoba, 1885. I had seen that painting before on several occasions and places without paying much attention to it. The truth is that it seemed quite gloomy to me. I always thought it represented some kind of meditation about death. My father must have interpreted in the same way because when he separated from his second wife and was diagnosed with Parkinson's, he put it in a box and never took it out again. It was as if, already approaching death, he did not want to look at her in the face. My father's death was not the first that painting witnessed, because it had previously decorated the bedroom where my great-uncle, Jose Maria González del Campo, whom we affectionately call Uncle Pepe, lived and died. As a child, I remember the painting hanging on a whitewashed wall next to his library and in front of his bed in his house in Córdoba. And then, Tío Pepe was a goldsmith, recognized for having restored the silver monsters of Enrique de Arfe, forged in 1514. That's the monsters, or custodia in Spanish, which is exhibited in the mosque cathedral. In addition, he was a painter and restorer of manor houses, most of them Renaissance and even medieval palaces. His jewelry workshop was credited for having carved a silver word for General Yanderas, a gold and silver statue of Saint Raphael that the city of Cordoba gave to Francisco Franco, the fascist general and dictator, and a silver and enameled chest in which King Juan Carlos I returned the ashes of Inca Garcilaso de la Vega to Peru in 1978. So that's the chest where the ashes of the Inca went. Another view of it. Garcilaso de la Vega, the Inca, was born in 1539 in Cusco, and he died in Cordoba in 1616. He was the natural son of a conquistador, Sebastián Garcilaso de la Vega, with a woman of the Inca nobility, Paya Chimbu Ocllo. He grew up in Peru, and his first language was Quechua, and he later learned Spanish. His father, abandoning Chimbu Ocllo, married a woman of the Spanish nobility. However, on his death, the father wanted to leave an inheritance to his natural son. With that money, Garcilaso moved to Spain, where he was cared for by an uncle who protected him and gave him access to a Western education. Garcilaso was the first native of America to write in Spanish. He wrote some texts, among which the royal commentaries of the Inca stand out. They relate what life was like in pre-Hispanic Peru and during the Spanish conquest. There was a controversy in Andalusia over the delivery of part of the Incas' ashes to Peru. Influential individuals, such as the president of the Royal Academy of Cordoba, were opposed. The Andalusian government abstained from participating in the event organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the royal household. However, the Peruvian ambassador thanked the gesture. This controversy took place after Franco's death and during the beginning of the transition for democracy. The conflict seems to reflect the change in the way the Spanish state related to Latin America. For Uncle Pepe, this situation could have been just a professional commission and an opportunity to create an important work of goldsmithing. However, it is possible that it was also a way to participate in the debate, demonstrating his open-mindedness. He returned to America what came from there, or at least part of it, both the Inca and the silver. And it's interesting because my family had this workshop where they made all these kind of works of art in gold and silver. And I always thought it was like a medieval thing linked to the guilds and things like that. But I learned doing this research that it actually came from the 16th century. And Enrique de Arfe, the man who created this work of art, was the first person to actually create that form of art, which is related to the silver coming from America and the gold coming from America. I didn't know that before. Let's see if I go to a next one. Oh, let's leave that one. Uncle Pepe was that single relative that exists in many families. To his great nephews, the children who ran around the house, he asked us to call him Papagayo or Parrot. That was his nickname. This nickname piqued my curiosity many years later. I asked my mother, why did we call Uncle Pepe Papagayo or Parrot? That was a joke, said my mother. I don't think there was any basis for Papagayo. He used to say, I'm not Papa, a dad. I'm Papagayo, the parrot. Because it seems like the grandchildren call him Papa, 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 Papa. He was kind of the patriarch of the household. And he said, I'm not a dad, I'm Papagayo, I'm the parrot. After the Spanish Civil War, I think I go to another one. That's the house where he lives, which is a 16th century palace that people say was the house where the doctor of Philip II lived, Fernán Pérez de Oliva. After the Spanish Civil War, Uncle Pepe took my grandma, whose name was also Carmen, Grandpa Paco, his brother-in-law, and their 4 children, to whom my father was the third, into his house. My father, who was born right after the end of the Spanish War, was named Jose Miguel in honor of Uncle Pepe. And I have to say that people are not saying the Spanish Civil War anymore, because they are claiming now with the memorialist movement that I'm going to tell you about, that it was not a civil war between Spaniards, that it was actually the beginning of the Second World War, because in the war, Hitler and Mussolini participated and were very important for Franco to win the war. So people are claiming now that it's not a civil war, it's a part of the Second World War. And actually, many Spaniards died in concentration camps in Germany, and that's things that people are discovering right now. However, Franco was interested in saying that it was a civil war because he wanted to stay separate from the Second World War, so he could stay as a dictator for many years after the war ended, and he stayed there, as you know, until 1975. It's not entirely clear to me what happened to the family in those years. I don't know how long my grandfather Paco was in jail, or how Uncle Pepe was able to get him out of there. Nor do I know how Uncle Pepe acquired in 1939, right at the end of the war, the Renaissance palace known as the House of the Luna, or the House of the Commander Luna. The facts are lost in the mist of and the silences surrounding that period. If any of you has seen this movie, Pan's Labyrinth, have you seen it? No? Oh, you should see it. It's very good. By Guillermo del Toro, the director, Mexican director, but he's descendant of Spaniards. You can see that there is a lot of kind of monsters and kind of mysteries. But when I was recovering the history of my family, I actually understood the movie, why it was so mysterious and full of kind of myths and monsters, because it's kind of how people see the period. My grandfather Paco was the owner of a bar and a militant in the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party. He was in prison and about to be executed at the beginning of the war. And it's very interesting, when I asked my other uncles, who are now 90 years old, about, he couldn't even tell me for how long he was in jail or what happened there. Like, they don't want to talk about it. They were even embarrassed, like, to talk that to say that their father was in prison, and he was about to be executed also. One of the things he told us is that when he was in jail, like every night, that was at the beginning of the war. I found out looking at newspapers later with a historian from Cordoba, but he said that every night, like a truck full of people, they would say, like somebody would come and say, you, and you. And they took a truck of people and they executed them. And there are many mass graves that in Cordoba that are being open now recently. But he was able to escape. And the interesting thing about the escape is that was a network of people that Uncle Pepe put together, including Bohemian. He was an artist. And I will tell you later that he was gay. So it was kind of a network of gay artists that crossed the Catholic Church, including the director of a movie theater that kind of were able to save him. So that's very interesting. One of the things I'm working on in this research is what I call, or what Primo Levi actually called, the gray zone, which is this kind of crossover. I mean, one of the things that I learned looking at this past is that things were not black and white, as I thought, as I have been taught as a child, but there were many grays. Like people, like my Uncle Pepe was a conservative, and he had good relations with the aristocracy because he worked doing all these kind of luxury goods for the aristocracy. But he was also gay, but on the other hand, he saved many people on the other side. So that's kind of some of the things that you learn, that it was not like the good people and the bad people, but there were ways in which people learned to survive under authoritarianism. And people, I mean, it was a small city, Cordoba. It's an agrarian small city. So people had to, they were related, they knew each other, So they kind of try to save each other. So continuing with the story as it's written, so as I said, grandfather was about to be executed when General Gonzalo Queipo de Llano took the city of Córdoba. The beginning of the war was particularly bloody in Córdoba because it was one of the first cities taken by the army of Franco. The Francoist side shot thousands of people whose bodies were deposited in mass graves. The province of Córdoba is the one that registered most courts martial in Andalusia, with about 9,000 files and 50,000 people that were sentenced to death. It is worth listening to the words of Juan Bernier, who was a contemporary of Uncle Pepe and part of his kind of network of artists and writers. A memoir of Bernier was discovered by he was also gay, so it was his great nephew that discovered his memoir and published it. In his work, he explains how the beginning of the war was experienced in Córdoba. He says, Mr. Gonzalo Queipo de Llano inaugurated those terrible speeches where he gave orders for mass shootings. The social hatred which I had detected for months in the street was becoming a reality. It emerged like a deep volcanic eruption, sweeping away all friendships, all respect, destroying the most sacred, family or friendly ties. The word social cleansing had emerged, and a subhuman ferocity could be heard through the airwaves on both sides. Chance pushed people to one side or another, depending on the place where each one had been surprised by the uprising. In 24 hours, the chants of the minority side, the fascists, the Cara al Sol, which was the kind of the fascist anthem, sounded throughout the streets of Córdoba, and unfortunate were those who had had a performance on the opposite side. The hand of man was the sport, and news were received from friends who had taken refuge in their homes, asking what they should do. But under the chance, killing and murder were conducted more or less legally. And only a few were lucky enough to be able to flee to the preferred side. The debate on memory, I think I have another, well, that's the bar that my grandfather had, and where the socialists kind of would meet, and even after Franco, they met in clandestine there in the bar, but he lost the bar after the war. And there are some anecdotes about that. For instance, like my grandma thought that my grandfather was a loser because he lost his bar and he had to live with Uncle Pepe, like being supported by him because of losing the war. But there was an anecdote where my grandma said that there were many children who were coming from the front and they had not eaten for many weeks. And they had like swollen stomachs because of hunger. And my grandpa would feed them in the bar. My grandmother says that they never were hungry because they had a bar, and people would line for the peels of the potatoes and also for the rest of coffee and things like that. So my grandpa fed the children, and the police came and told him, "Why are you feeding these red people, these rats?" And my grandpa said at that time, he said, "I don't see any rats. I only see children." That's what he said. But then, according to my grandma, he was too good, so that's why he was a loser. He was too good of a person. He always said, like, I wish like Franco dies before I do, but he actually died like 1 year before Franco because he had diabetes and then he became blind and he died just a year before. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about memory in Spain. The debate on memory has acquired enormous importance in Spain in recent decades. Well, actually, a lot of this I never knew. Like, I didn't, coming from there, I didn't even know that Cordoba was one of the places where more people died and that they were in mass graves. I had no idea, like no one talked about that. So silence is one thing that I am exploring Why so much? I mean, people were so scared because so many people were killed that they remained silent. And even like my uncles who are 90, they won't talk because they are still afraid. Even like after, I mean, the Franco dictatorship lasted for 40 years, but the fear is still there, even after like many years of democracy. Well, and now we are facing also like fascism emerging like everywhere else with the Vox party that is a fascist party in Spain. So perhaps they are right. Like it's not, I mean, the people, the descendants of those people are still around there. So the debate on memory has acquired enormous importance in Spain in recent decades. The pact of silence and impunity of the transition to democracy left many wounds unhealed and murders and human rights violations and other abuses unpunished. During the transition to democracy, the official position in Spain demanded to forget, continuing with the silence imposed on a part of the Spanish people by the Franco dictatorship. However, memory continued to be reproduced in the private and family sphere. That's another thing that I'm exploring because these truths didn't go away, but they were not in the public sphere for many, many years. They were reproduced in private. In the mid-1990s, this hidden memory erupted into the public space with a social movement called the Memorialist movement. The factors that reactivated memory were the beginning of the exhumation of the mass graves with the remains of those who were repressed, the creation of a citizen movement associated with this activity, the beginning of a critique of the dominant narrative of the transition to democracy, and a generational change. The memorialist movement is composed above all of the grandchildren of the repressed, among whom I count myself, although my grandfather didn't die, but he was also jailed. So a lot of people writing, there are many memoirs that are being written in Spain, films that are being made, and it's all made by the grandchildren because the children could never speak like my uncles because they were so afraid. Memorialist activism led to the publication of the Law of Historical Memory. I think I have another picture, yeah. There was a law of historical memory published in 2007 during the government of President José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero of the Socialist Workers' Party. Rodríguez Zapatero is also a grandson whose grandfather, Juan Rodríguez Lozano, was shot by the Franco troops during the war. Despite having contributed to its production, the memorialist movement had a tense relationship with the law of historical memory because it conceived of memory mainly as a matter of historical heritage and not of accountability and legal responsibility. The law of historical memory did not have continuity during the two legislatures when the right-wing party, Partido Popular, PP, governed, since they eliminated the budget for the memory policy. In October 2022, another socialist government under Pedro Sánchez, the current president of Spain, published the Law of Democratic Memory that considers and repairs some of the limitations of the previous legislation. Not only does it promote the recovery of the facts, the recognition of the victims, and the condemnation of human rights violations during the war and the dictatorship, but also establishes an office to investigate the atrocities and identify concrete reparations for the victims and the descendants. And this law is very interesting because not only it makes reparations for the victims of the Civil War, but it goes as far back as giving the Spanish nationality to Sephardi Jews who had to leave Spain in the 16th century, who went to Latin America, or other people who were kind of repressed by Spanish authoritarianism, going back to the 16th century. So it's a very, very interesting law. And I'm gonna tell you something, well, maybe I'll move ahead to how to write memory because I'm taking too much time. And something about the way you have seen a little bit the examples of how I'm writing this memory, and I want to tell you something about how we can write memory because that might be useful maybe for some of you who would be interested in working on your own memories. Um, Historian Pedro Piedras has argued that writing memory requires a flexible formal expression that transcends the rules established by academic disciplines. According to Piedras, disciplinary frameworks are too cold and distant to reflect the way people remember. Memory attempts, as the historians account, to understand the past, but it is not satisfied with describing or analyzing it. The narrative of memory wants to convey how it felt. It seeks to communicate a pathos and thus provoke empathy from the audience. In addition, the audience of the narrative of memory is not only academic, but wider. According to Piedras, the narrative of memory seeks to have an emotional impact and thus transform society. So memory is always written from the first person and always written from the present and always emotional. That's why it wants to use not only in narration or writing, but it also uses objects because memory has a lot of relation with objects. Objects is what kind of structures and spaces also, like the house or the painting, they structure memory, but it's also based on images, smells, feelings, not only like facts or events. So that's why, according to Piedras, the writing of memory has to be very interdisciplinary. And trying to write this, like I'm an anthropologist, but I was crossing over many disciplines like art history, literature, poetry. Some of the people that I'm reading to understand the period are poets. And one strategy that I'm using in order to write this is that, as you can see, it can be like a little bit incoherent, maybe you would think, but you kind of open something and you find a character and then you say, like, I want to find out more about who this person was, like Garcilaso el Inca, and then go back to the central story. And then more characters appear. Like, for instance, my grandmother and Uncle Pepe were natural sons of an woman, my great-great-grandmother, with an aristocrat, but they were illegitimate sons. And one of the things I found in the story is a lot of illegitimate children here and there. I want to investigate more what it meant to be an illegitimate children in Spain at the beginning of the 20th century. Probably had a lot of stigma. But interestingly, the Inca Garcilaso was also an illegitimate child. So I thought maybe that's why my uncle was interested in his story, because he was a natural child, but was also recognized eventually by his father. But there are lots of children circulating that people would raise. Like my grandma she raised 2 children. Apart from her 4 sons, she raised 2 more children that were orphaned under the war. So lots of circulation of children I found there. Anyways, but I was going to say that the great-great-grandma that raised my grandma was, her husband worked for a famous bullfighter, Machaquito. So when I see like, oh, they work for Machaquito, the famous bullfighter, so I go and find out who Machaquito was. So that's kind of the strategy of writing. Like it's like you're pulling like a rope. Because when I was a child, you hear all these stories, but you never know what they really mean. But once you hear a name, then you start to investigate. What is this person? I want to tell you one more story that is very kind of weird about this, and before we can have perhaps like a conversation, but I have some more. Well, that's one of the things that I do. One of the stories that is mixed with the story of my family is the story of the painter, of this kind of 19th century painting that you can see some details of. And the painter was this Rafael Ramírez de Arellano, an aristocrat in Cordoba. And at some point I thought that he might be the father that we never heard about of Uncle Pepe, because he was also a writer. He restored old buildings. He was like a historian of art. He also wrote a history of goldsmithing in Cordoba. So there were many parallels between the painter and the and the uncle. So that's one of the things that I was investigating, including who was kind of that figure there, for instance, that I thought it was a man originally, but then I realized it was a nun. It was a saint, actually Saint Catherine, and she was, I think, Santa Catalina de Siena. I think you translate as Catherine in English. But she was one of the two women that the Catholic Church has accepted as doctors of the church. One is Saint Therese, and the other is Saint Catherine. So it was a very interesting story of the saint that I figured out. I always thought it was a man. I don't know why I assumed that, because you never pay attention to things. But when I started to pay attention, the whole story is very interesting. She was anorectic. She never ate. She only ate the Holy Host that was called at the time anorexia mirabilis. There were a lot of kind of very interesting details about the saint. And I tried to figure out more why this particular saint was important in Cordoba. It was related to the Dominican order also. So that's a whole mystery. But another mystery that appeared in the story is, that's the kind of something that my grandma arranged about the family. And one of the things that was interesting there is kind of my nuclear family. The grandma is in the middle, and she's seeing the world from her perspective, and she's also on top of the painting. But her kind of partner was her brother, Uncle Pepe. They are to the right of the painting, or to your right, and is the kind of older man. And then my grandpa was represented underneath her as a young man. So it was like another son. So it's very, psychologically, it's very weird, but I grew up with it, so for us it was normal. But my father is the one underneath Uncle Pepe, because my father was an intellectual, and he became a labor lawyer, and he was a person who resisted the dictatorship during Franco times, defended many political prisoners. So he was kind of the intellectual, and he was kind of the protege of Uncle Pepe. But actually, he was rebellious against the uncle, because the uncle was a conservative, and he always kind of wanted to recover the memory of his father, who was a leftist, and then the other uncles are to the left. But that was interesting, how a gay man could also be the patriarch of a family. That's kind of, and also kind of a very respected person at that time, where and one of the things that I researched also was what it meant to be gay in Spain during the Franco dictatorship. And basically what it meant is that if you were discovered, or they were obviously in the closet, because if you were discovered, you were killed, like Federico Garcia Lorca, who was killed, who was executed in part because of being gay, more because he was not very militant leftist. He was a leftist, but not really militant in any political party. But he was basically executed for being gay. So they could execute you, but they could also send you to a labor camp or send you to jail. Most people were sent to jail, and they underwent many kind of humiliating medical examinations at the time. So it was very dangerous to be gay. So my uncle was always in the closet. And one of the debates is, if he was in the closet, should you take him out of it? And there is a debate, but I have consulted with friends who are gay, and they told me, yes, definitely, because he was in the, he actually never married, so he was not 100% in the closet. I know of two partners that he had. One of them lived at home. Supposedly he was like a boarder, like he paid for his room, but he actually lived in the house. He was a professor of physics and chemistry. So that was one of the stories. But another story that is very interesting is that when I told my mom, I think Uncle Pepe must have been gay because he never married and this and that, and my mom was like, no, because he was a conservative and he was very discreet. He never gave any scandal. And so he was not. And then I said, well, but he never married and he was an artist. And then my mom says, well, now that you say it, it makes sense that he was gay, because together with all his friends who were gay artists, poets, and also jewelers, they were all of them part of this religious brotherhood, of this Christ, of the Christ of the souls of purgatory. And they were all part. And actually, a famous poet, his name is Pablo García Baena, he even won a very important literature prize award in Spain. And another famous writer, Antonio Gala, who was also gay, and he also won the first prize for theater in Spain. They were part of this brotherhood. So that's another research that I have done about the brotherhood. How could it be that under fascism and in the Catholic Church, there was a brotherhood that was made up of the elder brother was gay, and it was made up of gay artists and writers and intellectuals. So that was kind of very, very interesting to me, very contradictory. That's another example of the gray zone. It's like all these kind of weird things. And the brotherhood was also a way to create this network. But one thing that reading, that's when I started to investigate. So why could this happen? And well, one thing I learned is that the brotherhoods were safe spaces for gay people because taking care of the saints was considered a feminine task. So gay people who were effeminate were always working on that. That's one thing that I learned. There is a saying in Spanish, if you know some Spanish, that is, they say, sin tonto ni maricón no sale la procesión. Without the disabled people, it's very offensive, but that's the way the saying goes. Without the gay person or the disabled person, the procession doesn't go out. And somebody who was gay told me this story, a journalist. But anyway, so that's a world that I discovered. But another thing that I discovered reading a historian of a memory of the Spanish Civil War is that one way when people were being tried for being gay in Franco's Spain, sometimes their moms would testify. So there are many letters from the moms saying like, oh, my son is gay, but he's a very good person. Or even like claiming that they walk like this, but it's because they have a problem in their hips. Or there were many letters that he was finding actually in the police archives. But a thing that he found is that one way to get away with being gay is by demonstrating that you were a very fervent Catholic and that you were a family person. So that made me understand my uncle Pepe, because he was the family patriarch, surrounded by he raised so many children and people, and he was also a very fervent Catholic in this brotherhood. And actually, I have to say that they were not hypocritical. I mean, the brotherhood, this is the group of artists. It's called the Grupo Cántico, a group of poets that were part of the fellowship. The one with the bottle is the one that we read before, Juan Bernier, and the one with a cigarette, I think there, is the poet who won the prize and was the elder brother, Pablo García Baena. But one thing that is interesting about the brotherhood is they were all artists, so the way they kind of recovered this brotherhood, which started in the 16th century. But they created a whole aesthetic, like this Christ is very beautiful. It's a 17th century statue, and instead of nails, it has flowers, it has lilies. And it's in the crown, I think I have a picture of the crown. That's the church. No, I didn't keep the picture of the crown. But the crown is made of like ruby flowers, ruby and gold flowers. So my point is that they were also able to recreate like an aesthetic in this brotherhood. It was like a safe space. It was a way to express themselves. It was also like a way to survive in this very authoritarian context. So that's kind of some of the explorations, and I never knew anything about that. So everything it was a surprise to me when I did the research. So basically, I'm gonna wrap up because I don't want to make you too tired, but these are some of the concepts that I have been telling you about, but just to wrap up, and maybe we can talk more of whatever is more of interest to you. But the things that I'm thinking of, and I'm still working on, because the book has 100 pages so far, but it's not finished. is the relationship between memory and objects is one thing that maybe you know a lot about. Materiality. For instance, many people were writing recently about clutter, and you have to get rid of clutter and you have to become minimalist. But there was another article that I really like about how clutter actually symbolizes social relations and people you knew and you are related to. So the objects are very important for memory. Some people say, well, the objects, the memory stays regardless of objects, but that's not true. A space and object is very important. And the other is memory and history. Memory is different from history. Another thing that I'm exploring, as I told you, is much more subjective, much more emotional, and much more interdisciplinary. Another idea is how to narrate memory, all these interdisciplinary tools that you need to narrate memory, because you need images, you need poetry, you need literature. So for me, it's a journey as a social scientist. Another is the relation between personal memory, family memory, and collective memory, because I'm writing this memory of my family, but I don't want it to be just for us. So that's why I'm kind of creating a context, a historical context, a cultural context for it, so it becomes more interesting for a wider group of people. Memory, silence, and forgetting, that's another concept. One thing that this course that you're taking is, I really like the name, it's called Echoes of the Past, Visions of the Future. And I really like the name of the course, because many of the things that we are learning here have so many meaning in the present. For instance, the whole question about survival under an authoritarian context, I think is very relevant to what we are living through. And also the concept of the gray zone, like what do we do? Kind of networks that cross over sides, many things that are interesting. And then, the question of game memory that I was also trying to recover there would be another concept. But basically, that's. Thank you very much for listening. And maybe you have some comments or questions, and I would really appreciate like any feedback because I'm still working on this, so that you can give me.
Thanks so much. And we're open for comments from the audience or anybody on Zoom.
I just loved your presentation, Carmen. One thing that comes to mind is, I don't know if you know this movie called La Lengua de la Mariposa, Lengua de la Mariposa, and it's the Civil War period, and it's a gentleman that he's a teacher, and it talks about the children. It shows how the children are being indoctrinated, and he as a teacher tries to illuminate them and let their imagination grow. But anyway, why I bring that up is because I think your process of trying to recreate this family memory is kind of like La Lengua de la Mariposa, because they use I guess, the butterfly unrolls its tongue. That's what Lengua de la Mariposa means. And it reaches out and it brings in things. And so anyway, your creative process, that could be a metaphor for you in your creative process, where you reach out and you pull in things and you break all these different norms. So look at that movie. It's really great. And it also talks about the children's perspective. And I think you'll enjoy that as well. And then one final comment, I don't want to dominate, but this is it's such a great topic. It seems like silence and memory are two concepts that are cloaked in darkness. And so it's really, but they're really fertile. So I don't know. I just think it's wonderful that you're exploring those two things as well. So we can talk later over these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Should we maybe let several people talk and then I can.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I'm interested in we had a civil war here that's, only it's about 150 years old. I don't know, our Civil War in 1860. And we still have issues about it. We still have divisions. Just try to put up a Confederate flag in Gainesville, and I think you'd have some issues. I'm just wondering how in Spain, which is so recent, I mean, it's less than 100 years old, how relations are between the various factions in Spain compared to how it is in the United States.
Well, maybe I'll respond to those two, and then we can continue the conversation. But thank you, Patricia, for your comments. I will definitely look at that film, because I mean, that's not my field, like looking at film and literature, but in this work I have to do it, and I will look for inspiration there. And Jan, and so thank you for your comments. And regarding the other question, is very good, your question, because one of the things that surprised me is that how things that happen very far away in history, like, are kept in memory, like how long memory can be. For instance, there are parts of the book where my grandmother hated Napoleon, for instance. Like, she remembered a lot about the Napoleonic invasion of Spain, which happened at the beginning of the 19th century, as you know, and he hated the French. And he had kind of anecdotes about that, which also related to the painter, because his the grandfather of the painter of the painting that I showed you was a liberal who was jailed during the Napoleonic invasion. So I thought, oh, maybe this one, at some point I was thinking maybe the painter is the father of Uncle Pepe, because they have like this hate of the Napoleonic invasion and the French. And so it was interesting how things that happened so long ago still have marks. Another thing that my grandmother remembered that was kind of remote was a tsunami that at the time was called maremoto, like it was not called a tsunami, a sea movement that happened because she says that her family used to have money because they own ships that went from, she's from kind of the very southern tip of Spain, Cadiz, and they had like ships that went from there to America, but then they lost them in this tsunami. And I was looking at what can this be? And it was the Lisbon, a tsunami in Lisbon in the 18th century that was kind of what triggered like scientists to start in the Enlightenment, to start studying these natural events. So that's, I was like, how can people remember as personal memory things that are so old? But more directly to your question, I also, like, when I was a child, the idea was, let's forget so we can move over. And that happened in Latin America and also in Spain. Like the idea that if we kind of try to push too hard on accountability and things like that, the dictatorship would come back. So it was very fragile, like in Argentina or in Chile, in other places. The situation was very fragile, so people was like, let's just forget, forgive, and move on with democracy. That was the attitude. And even my father, who was a labor lawyer and he defended political prisoners, he even had that attitude. But then I learned through Pedro Piedras, who is a friend that I mentioned, who has written a lot about memory, and he also wrote a memoir of his own family, that actually people who lost a loved one didn't forget. And for them, he says, like, it's not remote, it's like, is immediate to us. It's like the sense of time is very different. But then I also learned from Pedro Piedras that what we thought in the 1980s and 90s, that was the migration from the countryside to the city in Spain, we related it more to modernization and urbanization. But he said, no, that was related to the Civil War, because in my town had 4,000 people. From the 4,000, 2,000 were killed. And the survivors and the killers were living in a 2,000 people town. So people had to leave. So there were things like that. Another thing that he said is like people who have good positions in Spain, they might be progressive, but they tend to be the descendants of people who accommodated to the dictatorship. Like even if they are left wing today, like there is like a big economic gap that happened between the people who lost the war and those who won the war. In that case, in which people who lost, one thing that I was mentioning there is why my uncle bought the house in 1939. But one thing that happened in 1939 was the law of political responsibility, in which the dictatorship stole all the properties of people who were of the Republican side, not only leftists, but also kind of moderates and right-wingers, but that were democratic. So they lost all their properties. Some of them had to go into exile. So I think the past is not gone, like the consequences of the past are there. So people are talking about reparations. And I with this research, I never understood the question of reparations very well, but with this research, I understood a little bit better, because reparations does not necessarily have to be like money being paid to people. It can take many shapes. Reparations can be just like dignify the victims. It can be symbolic, like creating a monument for the victims. It can be like giving the Spanish passport to somebody who is the descendant of Sephardi Jews who was expelled in the 16th century. So it has many different. So I also thought a little bit about the question of reparations, but definitely the present. I mean, if you trace, like you can think, oh, the present has nothing to do with the past, but you start to look at the details. And as they say, the devil is in the details. And then you see, who are these people in Vox that are kind of bringing back fascism in Spain? And probably if you kind of research a little bit, you will find that they are related to some of those military or whatever, or fascists from the Falange, or so not necessarily, but because some of the, I mean, some generations change also, like many people who had parents who were conservative became progressive later in Spain. So it's not, there is gray zone too. They are not good and bad, but yes, I think it's very relevant, and it relates a lot to many of the discussions here. And I think the question of polarization is global. It's not only, let's say, happening in the US, but it's a more global process.
Other comments, questions, or feedback? No, wait for someone else.
Well, I thought your talk was absolutely fascinating, and I don't have enough to say about it, but I just wanted to say, as somebody who's lived through a lot of displacement and political events and so on in my life, that even if I tried to write it up, I wouldn't have the materials to work with. And I think you were very, very lucky that you were able to trace your family history back to the place of origin in Córdoba, that you're extremely lucky to have objects that you could touch and or see and retrieve from the past, and then you could build, like you could go into this labyrinth of possibilities once you were able to connect to these objects, and that you could even interview people and even note the silences of you had uncles that were alive, that, I mean, all of these things that I think we were so wonderful that you were so lucky to have that, and how difficult it is to be able to write a memory, for example, when all these opportunities are missing. So that was just my comment, because I think, like in my family, and you know, the silence of my parents and grandparents was extraordinary. And I think that, you know, it's so important to be able to, you know, to navigate your life without that silence. Because how can you know all the things that happened if the previous generation wouldn't tell you and you don't have anywhere to go? So, and you're not in the place where the events happened because you had to migrate to some other place. So that was my comment. And I just congratulate you and feel like it's wonderful that you had all the opportunities to build this and be an inspiration for other people to do similar things.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to respond before we move to another, because you said very, very important things there. And I hadn't thought about them, but thank you for the feedback, because I need to think about it more. But one of the things that I have faced also, talking about kind of the consequences of the past, at some point I thought, or maybe the very thing that I am in America and I came to the United States, or that I study Latin America, has to do with this story also of kind of not having a place there and being displaced. My father actually migrated from Cordoba to Madrid because he couldn't deal with all these ambiguities of the right and the left. And so he became a labor lawyer in Madrid. So he also had to leave. But one thing that you face when you leave and you're a migrant is that many people question your legitimacy. Like, even my sister would say, like, and my sister is a lawyer, and she's also kind of has kept a lot of archives of the family. And she's like a little bit jealous, like, why are you writing this story instead of like me being the writer? Or I have a cousin who is a journalist in Cordoba, and she's also like, oh, maybe I should write the story of Uncle Pepe and not you. So there is some questioning, but I remember like some of the people that I gave the manuscript to read told me, like, you're completely legitimate to write. Don't let people tell you that because you left, you cannot write your story. And so that's one thing, but sometimes you doubt of yourself because of that. And regarding the interviews is also, well, you have this experience, but you have this sense of urgency, because one of the uncles that I interviewed last year, that was the priest of the church where the Brotherhood was located, he just died right like last week. So these people are very, very, and some of them don't really want to talk. And there are many difficulties. For instance, the Brotherhood has an archive. And this archive goes back to the 16th century. And I wanted to know who was part of that Brotherhood since the 16th century, but the current elder brother didn't let me in. I said, well, I'm a professor. Maybe that was my mistake. I said, I'm a professor. I sent like a very formal letter. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. I would like to do research in your Brotherhood and this and that. And he kind of suspected that it was because the poets of Cantico were part of and they don't really like to publicize that part, because I think the Brotherhood later was taken by other people, more conservative. And he was kind of, well, just I'll let you look at the Cantico files, maybe. But then he said, he changed his mind, and he said, when I arrived in Cordoba, he said, no, actually, we cannot let outside people look at the archive. And I said, but I'm not outside. My uncle was part of the Brotherhood. That was worse. Like, when I said my uncle was part of the Brotherhood, he said, no way, you're not coming. Because they know of the memorialist movement and all the grandchildren writing the memoirs. So they don't want, I mean, there are forces of silence, not only like your own uncles that are afraid, but also these, like there is the Vox people and people on the right, they want to silence memory. They don't want people to be writing about it. So, but yes, it's very interesting what you say. Yeah, I think that was kind of it. But I'll think more about the privilege of having these objects and these people that I can still interview. Although I think, I was going to say go around is what I was thinking in terms of methodology. The Brotherhood told me you cannot see our archives, but I'm still trying to go around. I talked to the historians who are working on memory in Cordoba, and they say, well, you can use newspapers. There is always like a go I know that as an ethnographer also, because sometimes you are like want to talk to people that don't want to talk to you, and then you don't pay attention to those who want to talk. But there is always like a go around. If the Brotherhood doesn't lend me the archives, then I'll go to the newspapers or to other people, or find some contacts that will allow me to have access. But on the other hand, another thing that I wanted to know, to say that relates to your comments, is that the law of democratic memory of 2022 states clearly that memory is a right, and that people have a right to have access. So basically, I could go to Cordoba and tell the Brotherhood, I have the right to see these documents, but there is a gray zone there, because the Catholic Church might be seen as private and not a public kind of archive. So, and I have worked with the Catholic Church a lot, because in Latin America, I also do work with kind of liberation theology priests who work with indigenous people, and it's very hard to work with them, particularly for women, because they don't really want to have a lot of interaction with women. They don't respect women as much. Like the nuns can study, but not abstract topics. They have to study applied things. So there is a lot of kind of, but as a researcher and getting older, I think that there is always a go around, like an archive, a newspaper, something else that you can look at, even if you don't have the objects or the people.
Okay, thank you.
Comments, questions?
I'm curious that so much is known about people who you say were gay, and this was in the 30s. And I was wondering if they were known to be gay by the authorities, because in the United States, if you were gay up until really 1969, until we had the Stonewall event, you kept it quiet. You were not openly gay. You were in the closet. But it seems like they were openly gay in a fascist and a Catholic country, and I find that to be very, very interesting, contradictory in a way. I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, that was one of the things that, well, I don't think they were openly gay. They were kind of in the closet,
Okay.
but they never married, some of them. Most of them in that Brotherhood never married. And as I said, my uncle was able to live with his partner, the professor of physics and chemistry, pretending even up to today that he was like somebody renting a room in the house. So they never said openly, but it was very weird, because this, that was another story that I didn't have time to tell you, but this person who is very well known in Cordoba, no one knows up to today that he was gay. When he died, he left everything he had to my grandfather, who just came out of jail. There is a testament that I was able to get a hold of, in which he says that he should be buried with my family, and please don't bury him with his own family, like at all. Like he rejected his own family. He wanted to be buried. He said his real family was my family. He left all he had to my grandfather. And so, but it was not open at the same time. I have the feeling that, on the one hand, one intuition that I had is that some of them were aristocrats. So the class was important also. Like if you were a higher class, you had more chance of not to be touched than if you were more of a working class person. For instance, like in the world of flamenco, there were some people that this historian studies, Miguel de Molina, who was a flamenco dancer and singer, and he was gay also. And he was actually, like, his head was shaved by the fascists, and he was given purgant, so he could not perform or something. He was really like violated his rights, but he was more like working class. He had to go into exile to Argentina. So in the world of flamenco, some people who were gay were prosecuted, were jailed, like trans people who were more working class were also put in jail. But some of these aristocrats, actually like Juan Bernier, who grew up in a palace of Charles III in his town in Cordoba, he was also jailed. But the idea is, like the way my mother explained it is, they are not known, this is the words my mother put, they are not known to be gay because they didn't give any scandal. And they were discreet. So as long as they were discreet and they didn't give any scandal, they could be tolerated. So my feeling is that there was a policy like don't ask, don't tell. Like people knew, obviously, but and if they had married like my uncle, they could be important professionals. There is a portrait of my uncle painted by this Juan Jose. And I always saw it I never asked. And because I'm asking about everything, I said, who is Juan Jose who painted this portrait of the uncle? And my uncle that I interviewed said, Juan Jose was the jeweler who made the Valle de los Caídos, is this huge fascist monument that Franco built in Madrid. Well, not in Madrid, in El Escorial. He built it for the fallen ones of fascism. And this guy was making like all the goldsmithing and silversmithing for this monument. However, my uncle told me Juan Jose was an effeminate and he had a husband. So Juan Jose was working for the fascists while he was also like kind of openly gay. So that was very weird, but it was not openly, let's say. It was, as I said, they had to cover up with being family people and also with being very Catholic. And according to the historian who has worked more on that, Javier Fernandez Galeano, he says that when they were caught and put in jail, there were like recommendation letters, like they had to get a recommendation letter from the priest saying this is a good guy who comes to mass every Sunday. And from their mom, like the mom saying he's a very good son, even though he has these problems, but you know, he's a very good person. So yeah, the gray zone again is very interesting, but it was not kind of open even until today, but people knew. So because I mean, it's known.
Yeah, I had a question about how you put the memory of family members in context, determining what was true, what was additional to what has been known, and what type of historical and books of memory did you read to put these memories in context? Was it contemporaneous from the Spanish Civil War, the time of Franco, or perhaps post-Franco historical analysis, which probably took a different type of perspective and the freedom that followed in that period?
That's a very good question too, because originally, well, I'm a Latin Americanist. I'm an expert on Mexico and the Andes. So when I started to do this, I had to learn a lot. And I wasn't sure. I mean, I felt even guilty of working on this manuscript because it was like on the side, like I would do it. Because my real work is Latin American, indigenous people, and I'm in the Latin American Studies department in the university. So I was kind of doing it even with some guilt and this. But then I gave the initial manuscript, and I actually started to work in this manuscript because I took a creative writing class after finishing my book on indigenous people in Ecuador and extractivism. I took a creative writing class, and I said, well, I want to learn to, I don't know, I finished a book and I wanted to do something that I really wanted. But then I was feeling bad. So I gave to my advisor, who used to be the dean of the new school, Judith Freelander. She was my advisor for my dissertation. And I gave her the manuscript. And I said, Judith, should I continue working on this or should I forget about it? And Judith told me, she read it and she found it very interesting. And she said, and I said, but I don't know anything about the history of Spain because I'm an expert on Latin America. And she said, well, just read. That's what she said, but you do it. She kind of supported me in doing it. And I started to read, but now being a more senior scholar, I had more resources. For instance, I talked to the professors in Córdoba who are working on historical memory. I started to kind of read it for the context because I wanted to understand. I still need to do some more reading. For instance, I want to understand the thing about illegitimate children and how they circulated, more about what that meant and at that time. But yeah, but the thing is that, for instance, Pedro Piedra says that when he reads the history of Francoist Spain, that the history never satisfied him, because that's one of the things that he's working on, and many other people who work on memory, the difference between history and memory. For him, history is very detached, tries to be objective, but memory is more emotional and personal. And he was very disturbed when, like, his relatives who had been executed during the Civil War appear in a history book as just a statistic. So he said, oh, so just like in a bar graph. And he said, how can my grandfather be a part of a bar graph? This is almost, so it was insufficient, he said. And I think there is a lot to be written. Like when I talked to the historians in Cordoba, they said, nobody has written a cultural history like the one you're writing now. So it is not written yet, although many people, as I said, are writing memoirs, but it's a more kind of texture cultural history. But for instance, how do I know? There are a lot of myths, as you heard. So sometimes I have to kind of triangulate, as social scientists say. For instance, one of the myths is, or things that were mysterious to me, is why my uncle was able to buy this Renaissance palace in 1939, right when the property of these people is being. So my guess was, who was the owner of this? That was it expropriated during the war? Why does he buy it right after the war? So I had these questions, and one thing I did was to go to the local archives to see. There is like there is a file for that house coming from starting in the, at least in the 18th century. It doesn't go back to the 16th century, but I was reading the beginning of the file is written by hand. So one of the difficulties, I'm not a professional historian of kind of modern history, so I had to kind of read through the handwriting of the people, but I did read, and what I figured out, it was not, actually it belonged to some priest, the house, it was not taken from anyone, but I think he bought it with the inheritance from his partner who died during the Civil War. And that's why he buys the house in 1939. There were perhaps opportunities at that time because it was kind of, everything was destroyed. So things were probably cheap to buy, but I was always intrigued why this house became. And actually the house, as you can say, things are there, but they also disappear very quickly because the 16th century house is being sold right now. We are going to sign we are selling the house in September this year. So I'm very worried that I'm not there because they might destroy some papers or something. I have the feeling that my great uncle wrote a diary that people are hiding because the family doesn't want people to know that he was gay or something. So I'm after the diary, but I don't know if it exists or not, but I think it exists, because how come an intellectual in that period doesn't have correspondence or a diary? It doesn't make sense. Somebody who wrote and who was educated. So I think it exists. It might have been destroyed. And that's another thing that people working on gay archives say, that it is very, there are difficulties of working in the gay memory because sometimes the families destroy the archives, or people who had AIDS in the, let's say in the 80s, who died in that period. Sometimes the families burn everything that belonged to them. So there is a problem of archives. There are also families hiding elements of the archive or even destroying them. But my hope is that my grandma was so fond of her brother who saved her and her husband, that I don't think she might have destroyed. I think she probably hid it, but I don't think she would have the nerve to destroy it because of the love that she had for her brother. So I don't know. But there are still a lot of mysteries. But I look at them, and in order to get that, like the house documents, it was very difficult. I had to use a cousin who was working in the municipal archives because they didn't want to make it public. I mean, it's a small city, and it's very like difficult. You have to have contacts. Like, it's not open to anyone. And being like an outsider plays a role there too. Like, people are, how come you didn't come in the last 30 years and now you want to find out all these things? Like, so.
Okay, well, let's thank Professor Martinez Novo